Hello, everyone. We're glad to welcome you at today's webinar on ICH E9R1 Addendum on Estimands and Sensitivity Analysis. My name is Anna Yanaeva, and I'm Head of Business Development at OCT Clinical. I have joined OCT team over 8 years ago, and since then have been acting as the first contact person for sponsors, consulting them on all aspects of study planning, timelines, and costs. I'm happy to introduce my colleague, Kristina Bondareva. Kristina is head of biostatistics at OCT Clinical. Her in-depth knowledge and over 10 years of experience as a statistician in the sphere of clinical research has been a great value for sponsors, ensuring proper planning of statistical analysis within the clinical study. Hello, Kristina.
Hello, Anna. Thank you for the introduction.
Sure. So our goal today is to provide clarifications on the addendum on estimates and sensitivity analysis that came into effect last year. And before I pass the word to Kristina, I would like to remind you that you can see the box on the right side of your screen, so you can leave your comments or questions there, and we will be answering your questions at the end of the webinar. I also will be grateful if you can leave some comments and type something right now in the box so that we knew that everybody can hear us and see us well. So thank you for that. And in order to avoid any technical issues, we advise to use Google Chrome or Opera browsers. So now, Kristina, the floor is yours.
Thank you once again. I will start my presentation with a short introduction on the circumstances that led to the creation of the addendum on estimands and sensitivity analysis. The original ICH E9 guidance was issued in 1998, and since then, it has been the foundation for statistical considerations in the design, analysis, and reporting of clinical trials. E9 made an emphasis on minimizing bias and underlined the importance of randomization as a solid basis for obtaining unbiased estimates of treatment effect. The fundamental principles discussed in E9 continue to be valid and useful for any statistician. Nevertheless, it is natural that over the course of more than 20 years, the understanding of certain aspects has evolved. One of such aspects is related to handling missing data in the analysis, which undoubtedly is one of the most complex issues. Recognizing the importance and complexity of this problem led to the publishing in 2010 of the NRC Expert Panel Report on Prevention and Treatment of Missing Data in Clinical Trials. It focused on avoiding missing data and methods of drawing inferences with incomplete data, and also discouraged the use of single imputation methods, which were frequently used in several therapeutic areas. Interestingly, it was also the first official document to mention estimands. The publication of this report triggered considerable amount of research and literature on estimands and how to choose them. Consideration moved beyond missing data to include all events that could have implications for estimating quantities of interest. These discussions motivated the addendum on estimands and sensitivity analysis. The addendum emphasizes the importance of quantifying treatment effects. In fact, estimand is defined in the addendum as a precise description of the treatment effect reflecting the clinical question posed by a given clinical trial objective. It is also related to establishing the causal effects of the experimental treatment compared to control. Randomization provides a basis for such causal inference and protects against bias, but intercurrent events which occur after randomization and alter the course of randomized treatment can break the link between randomization and actual treatment received. It may lead to difficulties in attributing causal effects to the intervention of interest. Generally, intercurrent events affect either the existence or the interpretation of the measurements related to the clinical question of interest. For example, if a patient dies, subsequent outcomes do not exist. Treatment discontinuation or use of rescue medication, as well as any changes from initially randomized treatment, such as modification of background, addition of concomitant therapy, or switching to an alternative therapy, may affect our interpretation of the outcomes collected after this event. Intercurrent events are essentially related to causality and interpretation of results, and therefore they need to be taken into account in the description of a treatment effect. The addendum outlines 5 possible strategies for handling intercurrent events. The treatment policy strategy uses the actual values of the variable regardless of whether the intercurrent event occurred. The treatment effect targeted by such estimand would be a combined effect of the initially randomized treatment and treatment modified as a result of intercurrent event. Composite strategy is to include the intercurrent event into the variable definition. It can be justified when intercurrent event itself provides all necessary information or represents the most meaningful outcome. For example, the need to take rescue medication because of poor efficacy or to undergo a surgery may be considered such meaningful outcomes and be integrated in the variable definition as favorable clinical outcome and no use of rescue medication or no surgery. Composite strategy is often used for intercurrent events that preclude the observation of the variable, such as death. Including death in the composite outcome, however, changes the question of interest. Instead of measuring the effect of treatment on the disease, we're assessing the effect on the disease and survival. Another important consideration, when applied to discontinuation of randomized treatment, is the extent to which the benefits reflect differences in discontinuation rates and not the clinical improvement. Hypothetical strategy aims at answering the question, what would the treatment effect be if the intercurrent event had not occurred? For example, if all patients remained on the initially randomized treatment, did not receive rescue, etc. It is useful when the intent is to assess efficacy and adherence separately. However, implementation of this strategy requires strong and often unverifiable assumptions. It is important to explicitly state what hypothetical scenarios being considered. For example, following premature treatment discontinuation, subjects might receive no treatment or switch to rescue medication. Two possible hypothetical scenarios for these types of intercurrent events could be, for the first one, what would have happened if patients stayed on the initial treatment, and for the other, what would have happened if patients discontinued the initial treatment and received no treatment for the rest of the study. Such hypothetical scenarios should be clinically relevant and interpretable. For example, what would have happened if subjects who discontinued treatment due to an adverse reaction continued to receive the randomized treatment would hardly be clinically relevant. While on treatment strategy may be considered when the outcomes up to the intercurrent event provide all necessary information and the duration of treatment is not important. For example, the palliative treatment of terminally ill patients, the outcomes up to the death are relevant for estimating the effects of interest. This strategy might also be useful when the rate of the outcome can be considered constant, for example, the rate of exacerbations of COPD while on therapy. But if the treatment effect must be measured at a specific time point, it is not possible to apply the while on treatment strategy. With principal stratum strategy, the intent is to adjust for the occurrence of the intercurrent event. It is achieved by assessing the treatment effects within principal strata of subjects who would or who would not experience intercurrent events on both treatments. For example, we could be interested in the effect of treatment in subjects who would be able to tolerate that treatment and the control, or evaluating a causal effect of vaccine on viral load in subjects who would become infected regardless of randomization to placebo or vaccine. In a parallel group study, it is not possible to directly identify the stratum the subject belongs to, since each subject receives only one treatment, and their status with respect to the occurrence of intercurrent event on the other treatment is not known. Therefore, membership of principal stratum must be inferred, usually imperfectly, from covariates using statistical modeling. It is important to distinguish between principal stratum and analysis in subgroups defined by actual occurrence of intercurrent event on the assigned treatment. The latter is prone to confounding because different subjects might experience intercurrent event on the test and on the control treatment. The estimand is defined through specification of 5 elements or attributes. The first, and not initially present in the draft addendum, is the treatment. Are we interested in estimating the effect of initially randomized treatment alone or the initially randomized treatment plus rescue medication? All the treatment modifications which are still part of the treatment regimen we're interested in should be included here. The second is the population of interest, which could be the whole patient population defined by the inclusion-exclusion criteria, a subgroup based on baseline characteristics, or principal stratum. The third is the variable or endpoint used to quantify the effect of interest, which usually includes a specification of when and how the endpoint is measured. For the fourth attribute, during the planning stage, multidisciplinary teams should proactively identify potential intercurrent events and consider how they will be addressed, that is, to define strategies to deal with these intercurrent events. It should be noted that different strategies could be applied to different types of intercurrent events. You could use treatment policy for the one, and hypothetical for the other, and maybe composite for the third. Finally, the fifth attribute is the population level summary for the variable that provides a basis for comparison. For example, it could be mean or proportion in each treatment group. And comparisons could be performed using mean difference between treatment groups or the difference in proportions. The 5 elements of the Estimand definition are interrelated, and specification of one element may influence the choice of the other. Population level summary should be appropriate for the chosen variable. The strategies chosen to account for the intercurrent event also need to align with the treatment, variable, and population attributes. Considerations for choosing primary estimate may include the specifics of the disease, availability of alternative treatments, whether the treatment goal is disease modification or symptom control, who is the decision maker, and are they interested in maximum efficacy or effectiveness in practice? Does the treatment discontinuation imply poor outcome? So the very important message of the addendum is that first we need to think about what we would like to estimate. That is, decide on the estimand, and only after that should we consider how it will be estimated and decide on the appropriate methods for the analysis, or estimator. In order to estimate something, we often need to make some assumptions in the analysis. Sensitivity analyses focus on investigating these assumptions and the robustness of the result to the deviations from these assumptions. Assumptions should be clearly stated, and one or more sensitivity analyses should be provided for the main estimator. The supplementary analyses are different. They are not conducted to investigate the assumptions, but in order to more fully investigate and understand the trial data. Unlike sensitivity analysis, they may target a different estimate. Different strategies for intercurrent events rely on different assumptions, including those related to missing data. When using treatment policy strategy, subjects are supposed to remain in the study and be assessed after the intercurrent event occurs, and these measurements are used in the analysis. The only remaining consideration is that some data could still be missing, for example, as a result of study withdrawal. In this case, the imputation methods should take into account the information on the occurrence of intercurrent event prior to the dropout. The implementation of composite strategy is closely related to non-responder imputation for binary data and baseline observation carried forward for continuous endpoints. Both approaches yield complete data, therefore no assumptions about missing data required. However, these methods lead to unbiased estimation only when the mean change or response rate in a placebo group is zero, which is not always true taking into account potential beneficial effects arising from the participation in the clinical trial. Reference-based imputation using under hypothetical strategy may be a better option. It is also possible to assign different rankings to intercurrent events based, for example, on the time or reason of occurrence. Worse ratings can be assigned to treatment discontinuations due to death, followed by lack of efficacy, followed by adverse events. Within each category, early events can be assigned worse ratings. After replacing data with ranks, a non-parametric test such as Wilcoxon rank sum test can be applied. Rank-based methods involve several important considerations. They do not estimate the treatment effect on the original scale. Therefore, it may be difficult to tell if the estimated difference is clinically relevant. Another difficulty is to assign proper rankings. For example, is discontinuation due to lack of efficacy actually worse than discontinuation due to an adverse event? An alternative approach is estimating difference in trimmed means. The intercurrent event is assigned the worst possible score, and equal fraction of worst outcomes is trimmed from each treatment group. For example, 30% worst responders. This fraction should be specified in advance and should exceed the expected percentage of intercurrent events in either group. The mean of the remaining observations is then estimated and compared between groups. However, this approach doesn't preserve randomization, since analysis is carried out only in a subgroup of best responders. It is also not so straightforward to interpret as a common difference in means. In hypothetical strategy, data after intercurrent events are considered irrelevant and are excluded from analysis. Therefore, methods commonly used for handling missing data are applicable. Methods valid under missing at random assumption include likelihood-based methods such as mixed model for repeated measurements and multiple imputation. Among missing not at random methods, one of the most popular approaches is reference-based imputation, where values are imputed from data in another arm or subset of patients in the trial, the reference group. One of the most common methods used to assess sensitivity to departures from the assumptions is delta adjustment. Delta adjustment assumes that patients who had irrelevant data due to an intercurrent event had outcomes that were worse than similar patients who did not have an intercurrent event. The difference or adjustment, delta, is applied to imputed values, usually only in the experimental arm. It can also be applied repeatedly to find out how extreme the delta must be to overturn significance of initial results. This is so-called tipping point analysis. Delta adjustment can be implemented to investigate both missing at random and other assumptions that we make when using missing not at random methods. For example, about what would have happened under a treatment regimen that was not used in the study or was not followed. While treatment strategies are used when the rate of an event or outcome is constant. Applicable methods include negative binomial model for recurrent data, which assumes constant hazard over time, or a linear model with random effects for slope and intercept applied to measurements obtained prior to the intercurrent event. Another option could be to analyze change to the last value or average of values prior to the intercurrent event. Using the last value yields no missing data. When using average responses, intermittent missing data could be imputed, for example, using multiple imputation. Speaking about principal stratum strategy, if the stratum membership is not correctly identified, treatment comparisons can be biased. Consequently, it is necessary to assess robustness of conclusions to the assumptions, in this case, stratum membership, using appropriate sensitivity analysis. Several guidelines for therapeutic areas issued by EMA and FDA in recent years included considerations for appropriate estimands and expected strategies to account for different intercurrent events. EMA guidelines include draft guidance on diabetes, guidances on ulcerative colitis, Crohn's disease, and Alzheimer's disease. Probably one of the most popular examples of how different stakeholders may have different perspectives regarding the scientific question of interest is related to diabetes. The sponsor presented data on dapagliflozin at a public advisory committee meeting. The primary endpoint was the change in glycated hemoglobin from baseline to 24 weeks. For ethical reasons, patients were allowed to receive glucose-lowering rescue medications. Measurements collected after initiation of rescue medications were set to missing and imputed using last observation carried forward, which was standard practice at that time. The FDA statistical reviewer acknowledged that last observation carried forward had several limitations and requested that the observed values of patients who were rescued be included into the analysis, since such approach was more compatible with the ITT principle. At the first glance, it might seem as a debate over statistical methods, but in fact the disagreement is much more profound. The implied scientific questions are fundamentally different. The sponsor is interested in establishing the treatment effect of the initially randomized treatments had no patient received rescue medication, while FDA statistician is comparing the treatment policies, dapagliflozin plus rescue versus control plus rescue. In 2018, the EMA published a draft guideline that specifically discusses the use of estimands in diabetes trials. The draft guideline recommends that the primary estimand for glycated hemoglobin should use the hypothetical strategy to account for initiation of rescue medication and use the treatment policy strategy for the intercurrent event trial product discontinuation. In other words, treatment effect that is free from the impact of other glucose-lowering agents, regardless of trial product discontinuation is targeted. The Estimand framework has already been incorporated into real studies of anti-diabetic drugs. For example, in the Pioneer program, two different scientific questions were addressed. The treatment policy Estimand evaluated the treatment effect regardless of trial product discontinuation or use of rescue medication. The trial product Estimand evaluated the treatment effect assuming that all patients remained on the initial trial product and didn't use rescue medication. Note that the strategies are slightly different from those recommended in the EMA draft guideline, but the studies were planned prior to its publication. Here, the same strategy is used for both intercurrent events in each of the estimates, which is generally not a requirement. The estimates obtained for the two estimates in Pioneer 5 study are presented in the table. As you can see, the estimated treatment effect is greater for the hypothetical or trial product estimand, though the difference is small in this case. Here's another example, this time from EMA guidance on Crohn's disease. Note that the intercurrent event of treatment discontinuation is handled differently depending on whether the treatment intent is inducing remission in the short term, in this case treatment policy strategy is acceptable, or maintaining remission or demonstration of the effect in the long term, in which case it is recommended to use composite strategy. It illustrates that treatment intent is one of the factors which are taken into consideration when choosing the primary estimate. The next example is from the paper by Bogdana Ratitch and co-authors defining efficacy estimates in clinical trials, examples illustrating ICH E9 Revision 1 guidelines. The study from this example was not originally planned with the estimate framework in mind, so the authors tried to retrieve the necessary information from description of methods in published materials. It was a confirmatory trial of an injectable biologic agent in subjects with rheumatoid arthritis inadequately controlled by methotrexate. The drug or placebo were administered in combination with a stable background methotrexate therapy. There were two co-primary endpoints: 20% improvement according to American College of Rheumatology response criteria measured at week 14, and change from baseline to week 24 in Health Assessment Questionnaire Disability Index score. There was a planned assessment of minimal required response at week 16 for all subjects in order to decide whether they should initiate rescue therapy. Rescue was offered in the form of escape therapy. It consisted in switching to the active drug for patients receiving placebo, or switching to the higher dose of active drug for patients randomized to the lower dose arm. It was also anticipated that the study investigators could occasionally modify background treatment per clinical judgment. In order to start with the construction of Estimand, it is necessary to formulate the objective. Note that the trial objective is formulated very precisely. It directly identifies the main stakeholder, regulatory agency, and also highlights that the treatment regimen of interest doesn't allow for any modifications of therapy. The description of the treatment attribute of the Estimand is even more detailed. Treatment regimen under evaluation is a randomized treatment without any adjustment to the background therapy, but allowing early discontinuation because of reasons other than lack of efficacy. The population and variable attributes are defined as usual, so let's review the potential intercurrent events and the strategies that were selected to deal with them. The first is treatment discontinuation for reasons other than lack of efficacy, without further initiation of any adjustments to the background therapy. In this case, observed outcomes after the intercurrent event are compatible with the treatment regimen of interest, and we can use treatment policy strategy. The second is initiation of the escape therapy. For this intercurrent event, a hypothetical strategy will be used to estimate what would have happened if subjects did not receive the escape therapy and continued on their randomized treatment. The third is treatment discontinuation for lack of efficacy or initiation of any other therapy adjustments. Subjects with these intercurrent events will be considered treatment failures after the start of such treatment changes. Therefore, the composite strategy will be used. The population level summary is the proportion of subjects with ACR20 response at week 14, with comparisons based on estimating the difference in proportions and chi-square test. For Health Assessment Questionnaire Disability Index, the population level summary is median change from baseline to week 24, and the comparison will be based on the composite outcome converted to ranks, where treatment values will be assigned the worst rank, and Wilcoxon rank sum test will be applied. Now that we have decided on the Estimand, we may proceed to the estimator. Actually, we have already started by discussing how the comparison will be performed. Another important consideration is that the observation for subjects initiating escape therapy will be excluded from the analysis under hypothetical strategy and need to be imputed or modeled. Since all subjects who meet the rescue criteria will initiate the rescue, there will be no reference group for estimating the statistical model to predict relevant outcomes for these subjects. In this case, we need to make additional assumptions. For example, the subjects would not improve or worsen if they remained on their randomized treatment. It is similar to last observation carried forward, but can also be implemented using multiple imputation. Intermittent missing data or missing data resulting from study withdrawal unrelated to lack of efficacy can be imputed using multiple imputation under missing at random assumption, since it is reasonable to assume that the values would be similar to those subjects with similar baseline and previous post-baseline values in the same group. The sensitivity to missing data can be investigated using a more extreme assumption, where all subjects with missing data are considered treatment failures. Another useful approach in order to investigate assumptions as discussed before, is delta adjustment and tipping point analysis. I will finalize my presentation by summarizing the most important messages and changes introduced in the addendum on estimands and sensitivity analysis. The key message of the addendum is that research questions should be defined clearly and unambiguously for each of the study objectives through the specification of appropriate estimands. The identification of possible intercurrent events, planning for strategies to account for these events, and overall defining an appropriate estimand is not a purely statistical issue. However, estimands are still mostly familiar to the statistical community. The role of the statistician would be very important in introducing this concept to other functions within their companies and involving the colleagues in the discussions regarding the scientific question of interest. The structured framework facilitates this dialogue between different disciplines within the company as well as between sponsor and regulator. Another important clarification in the addendum is a distinction between missing data and intercurrent events. Withdrawal from the study or missing a visit are not intercurrent events and should be handled in the statistical analysis. Unlike missing data, intercurrent events are not something to be avoided. Discontinuations of prescribed treatment, use of additional medication may occur in clinical practice and need to be considered when defining the clinical question of interest. The addendum to E9 also discusses the importance of sensitivity analyses. They should target the same estimand but vary in the underlying assumptions of the statistical model. Supplementary analyses include all other investigations that can target different estimands. The addendum has been already adopted by the EMA, and active implementation phase has already started. Some questions, both technical and conceptual, will probably arise. For example, the guideline doesn't specify where estimates should be described within the study protocol, so the companies will need to decide on how to adjust their templates. It is not yet completely clear how traditional analysis populations, for example, per protocol population in non-inferiority studies, would be compatible with the new Estimand framework. As we have seen, estimands are already being incorporated in therapeutic area guidelines. For some indications, they are already developed and should be adhered to. For others, early communication with the regulator will be crucial in developing and agreeing upon suitable estimates. The Estimand framework put forward by the addendum provides the common language for this discussion. On this slide, I have placed some references that were extremely helpful for me in preparing this presentation. So let me thank you for your attention. And
thank you so much. Yes, thank you so much, Christina, for all the clarifications and explanations that you provided based on real-life examples. And of course, it is true that proper planning of a clinical study starts with the formulation of the clinical trial objective. And understanding of the concept of sensitivity and the correlation between the estimands and the approach to the analysis, to the statistical analysis, is crucial if we want to ensure correct interpretation of the study results and the treatment effects. So we hope that today's webinar added some clarity to this complex topic, and we're now ready to take the questions. So I will read some of them and let Christina answer. So the first question is, does the addendum change the perception or interpretation of ITT principle? Christina, are you ready to take this one?
Yeah, sure. I will give it a shot. The ITT principle is in the traditional sense implies that all randomized subjects should be included into the analysis and that they should be analyzed according to the randomized treatment rather than the actual treatment. And the third one is that all patients should be followed up regardless of adherence to the initial randomized treatment. and their assessment should be used in the analysis. This last one is kind of controversial, and there has been a lot of disagreement regarding this. The addendum recognized that the clinical question implied by the last part of this definition may not always be relevant for clinical and regulatory decision-making. Adopting treatment policy strategy for all possible intercurrent events is questionable in most cases. Treatment policy can be applicable in specific cases, but its use should be motivated by scientific question and not just by the compliance to the ITT principle. The need to collect measurements after treatment discontinuation or initiation of rescue should also be decided based on the Estimand, taking into account cost and benefits.
Thank you. Thank you, Christina, for answering this one. And we have several more questions. Should estimands be defined only for confirmatory trials? Are they applicable to early phase trials?
Yeah, estimates are applicable for all clinical trials since all clinical trials aim at estimating something. But scientific question addressed might be different. One of the main differences between estimates for an early phase trial and a confirmatory trial would be the decision maker or stakeholder. Confirmatory trials are most often conducted in order to obtain regulatory approval, while early phase trials are used to establish proof of concept and to decide whether the drug should advance to later stages. So the sponsor will be the key decision maker in this situation. At phase 2, sponsor might be interested in the treatment effect under a hypothetical scenario that all subjects adhere to treatment. Conversely, in phase 3 study, the primary interest must be in the treatment effect regardless of adherence, and may be allowing for some therapy modifications to better reflect the clinical practice. But in addition to the primary, we might also benefit from having additional estimates on phase 2, which could provide estimates useful for the planning of further trials, including phase 3 trials.
Thank you. Another question is with regards to whether you can get access to the presentation afterwards. And I can answer yes. Everybody who wants to get a presentation will get it. And actually, you can leave some indication in the chat section, or just type that you want to get a presentation, and we will send out the slides to those who want to get them. And one more question I think we still have time to take is, could the Estimand framework be helpful in addressing the impacts of COVID-19 pandemic in clinical trials? Christina, will you be able to answer that?
I'll try to answer. I think we may need to identify additional intercurrent events related to the pandemic disruptions in case we think that they should be handled differently from similar intercurrent events that are not pandemic related. For example, we might need to account for non-adherence due to pandemic conditions, a death due to COVID-19, or receiving concomitant therapy for COVID-19, especially experimental therapy. The general idea is that original objective is unlikely to change. That is, we're interested in treatment effects which are not confounded by the pandemic situation and the related disruptions, as we all expect that the situation will normalize. It doesn't automatically mean that we need to apply hypothetical strategy to all pandemic-related intercurrent events, though it is likely that the most natural choice will be hypothetical strategy for some of them. We might also define additional estimates to describe the treatment effects, for example, in subpopulations which emerged due to COVID-19.
Okay. Thank you very much, Christina. So I think that would be it for today because I'm afraid we are out of time. So I would like to thank you all for participation and your involvement through asking very interesting questions. So I will be glad to continue the dialogue in the emails. Please feel free to reach out to us with any queries. I will send the slides as promised. And so thank you very much again and goodbye.
Thank you. Thank you for joining. Goodbye.